The night Nora Callahan finally understood the difference between being chosen and being used. The chandeliers in the Plaza Ballroom were blinding, the champagne was cold, and the man she had given 3 years of her life to was tucking a strand of hair behind another woman's ear, as if Nora did not exist. She did not gasp. She did not drop her glass. She stood at the edge of the room near the curtains near the exit, the way she always stood at these events. And she watched Declan Hale do what she now understood he had been doing for a very long time. He was simply no longer bothering to hide it in a room where she was present. The woman in the red dress was named Ingrid Voss. Nora did not know this yet. At this moment, she knew only the specific angle of Declan's head as he leaned toward her and the way Ingrid Voss closed her eyes briefly when he spoke near her ear, and the quality of that expression which Nora recognized because she had worn it herself 3 years earlier at a reception exactly like this one, when Declan Hale had stood close to her and said things that made her feel like she had been discovered. She had been 26 years old. She had believed that being chosen by a man like him meant something permanent. She placed her champagne flute on the nearest surface. She did not look at it again. She retrieved her coat from the attendant near the door without making eye contact, and she pushed through the heavy brass doors of the plaza and stepped out onto Fifth Avenue into the middle of a November thunderstorm that had been building for hours and now arrived with no apology. The rain hit her immediately. It came sideways, driven by wind moving through the gaps between buildings with specific and personal malice. Her dress was soaked within 15 seconds. Her heels found a crack in the sidewalk, and she stumbled, caught herself on a doorframe, and kept moving. Her car was in the garage 2 blocks north. She had driven herself that evening because Declan said he would arrive separately. Logistics. She had stopped questioning the logistics approximately 8 months ago. She reached the garage. She found her car on the 2nd level. She got in and sat in the dark for 40 seconds before starting the engine. Long enough to breathe. Not long enough to feel everything that was waiting to be felt. She pressed her palms flat against the steering wheel and registered the cold of it. And she did not cry because the crying would come later. And she was not ready for later yet. She pulled out of the garage and headed toward the highway. The streets of Manhattan were manageable in the storm. Traffic slowed everything, red lights gave structure. The city around her was indifferent in the way cities are, enormous and unconcerned with the specific catastrophes of individuals moving through it. But once she crossed the bridge and reached the section of highway heading north toward the apartment she technically still shared with Declan, the conditions changed without warning. The road's surface was a continuous sheet of water over asphalt, and the wind pushed at the car in irregular gusts that required constant correction. She was driving too fast for the conditions. She knew this. Some part of her brain had registered it and filed the information somewhere she was not currently able to access, because the part of her brain that was running the car had vacated and left something raw in its place. Something that was running a loop of Declan's hand on Ingrid Voss's back. Something that was adding up 3 years of small concessions and arriving at a total she had been refusing to look at directly for longer than she wanted to admit. She saw the curve late, not catastrophically late. She saw it in time to press the brake. She had that. But the brake found nothing useful on a road surface that was more water than asphalt, and the car began a slow and terrible rotation that she felt in her stomach before she felt it anywhere else. The tires losing their argument with the surface in a way that was completely beyond her ability to reverse, and then the guardrail arrived. It was not a sound so much as a sensation that began at the front of the car and traveled through her entire body in one long and continuous note. Then nothing. She returned to consciousness in pieces. Sound first. A mechanical beeping, steady and indifferent. the low hum of a ventilation system, the distant compression of a pneumatic door somewhere down a hallway. Then light, the institutional quality of hospital lighting present everywhere, and flattering nothing. Then pain distributed across her ribs on the left side and her shoulder and a point above her right eyebrow that pulsed with its own separate rhythm. She did not move immediately. She catalogued. An intravenous line in her left arm, the faint burn of something moving through it. Her right hand was free. Her ribs responded to breathing with a pressure that was uncomfortable but survivable. A monitoring lead on her chest. Above her right eye, she could feel the presence of bandaging, and behind the bandage, a headache that was significant but not the worst thing currently happening to her. She turned her head toward the door. The room was not empty. There was a man sitting in the chair by the window, not next to the bed. The chair by the window positioned so that he could see both the door and the bed simultaneously. It was the placement of a man who did not put himself in situations he could not evaluate. He was not reading. He was not on his phone. He was not performing the busy indifference of someone who happened to be waiting nearby. He was simply present, awake, looking out the window with a stillness that was not relaxation. It was something contained, energy held rather than absent. He was perhaps 52 years old, though the years had not diminished him. He was built with the solidity that comes from decades of physical discipline, rather than youth, broad-shouldered hands resting on his knees with the looseness of a man entirely comfortable with his own stillness. His face was lean and deeply marked by time. And it was not a kind face in the conventional sense. It was a face that had made difficult decisions and lived inside them afterward. A face that had negotiated with hard things for so long that the negotiation had become his baseline. His suit was dark charcoal, fitted precisely, completely inappropriate for a hospital at whatever hour this was. He wore it as though he had come directly from somewhere formal and had not considered changing, or as though he was simply always dressed this way, which she suspected was closer to the truth. She knew who he was. She had seen photographs. She had heard Declan say his name in the specific way people say the names of things they are simultaneously proud of and afraid of. She had been present at 2 events in 3 years where Rowan Hale had also been present, and each time Declan had kept her away from him with a care that had seemed protective in the moment, and now seemed in this fluorescent lit room with its beeping monitors like something else entirely. "Rowan Hale," she said, not quite aloud, more like a confirmation of something. He turned from the window and looked at her. His eyes were dark and direct and entirely without the performance she had expected from a man in his position. No strategically deployed warmth, no calculated concern visible behind a mask of worry. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something they need to understand. "Are you awake?" he said. His voice was low and carried no unnecessary weight. It was not the voice of a man who needed anyone to know. He was in the room. "How long?" Nora said. Her own voice came out rough and strange. There was a head injury. They were careful. She absorbed that. Then Declan. Something shifted in his expression. Not much. A quality of control almost invisible. "Not here," he said. She turned her head back toward the ceiling. The beeping continued its indifferent rhythm. She breathed carefully around the pressure in her ribs. His message, Rowan said, was that he was occupied with something and would come when he could. She heard the precise flatness with which this was delivered. He was not offering sympathy, and he was not offering contempt. He was a man reporting a fact while being entirely aware of what that fact meant. "When was the message sent?" she said. 11 hours ago." She closed her eyes. The image returned without invitation. Declan's hand placed low on Ingrid Voss's back. The ease of his smile. the way he had been completely entirely unconcerned with Nora's presence in the same room. "Why are you here?" she said. Police contacted the family when they found the car. Declan's number went to voicemail. "So you came." He set his hands on his knees. "Yes," he said. She opened her eyes and looked at him again. He was still watching her with that same direct attention, and she realized that he was not looking at her out of interest or sympathy or any performance of those things. He was looking at her the way he would look at anything that required his full attention, with complete presence and no editorializing. "I know who you are," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. A recognition. "Nora," he said, as though confirming something he had already decided. "Declan calls you something shorter. Most people do. Would you prefer that?" She thought about it briefly. "No," she said. "Nora is fine." He nodded once the way a person nods when they have registered something and moved on. The doctor arrived 30 minutes later and spoke at length and in careful clinical language about the inventory of her damage. A hairline fracture of the 5th rib on the left side, a concussion classified as moderate severity, soft tissue damage to the left shoulder that would require physiotherapy over several weeks, the laceration above her right eyebrow which they had closed with 8 stitches and which would leave a scar that could be minimized but not eliminated. She listened to all of it. Rowan remained in his chair by the window, not participating in the conversation, but present throughout it. When the doctor left, he was still there. "You should go," she told him. "I am sure you have things." "I have things," he confirmed. "They will keep." "You do not know me." "No," he said. "I do not." He said it without apologizing or elaborating, as though the logic of his continued presence required neither explanation nor justification. And she was too tired and in too much pain to argue the point. And somewhere beneath those two things, beneath the exhaustion and the pain, she was aware that his presence in the room was performing a function that the empty chair beside her bed was not. She fell back asleep. When she woke, it was afternoon. He was gone. But on the bedside table, there was a cup of coffee, still warm, and a folded note in angular, deliberate handwriting that said, "Back this evening. The nurses have my number if anything changes." No signature. There was no need for one. She held the cup in both hands and drank it slowly, without looking at her phone, where she knew that Declan's message would eventually arrive, calibrated with the precision he had always brought to managing difficult situations, expressing just enough concern to appear genuine, without committing to anything that might require him to be present. She thought instead about a man who had sat in a hospital chair for 14 hours for a woman he did not know, and then left her a cup of coffee and a note with no performance attached to either. Declan arrived the following afternoon. She heard him before she saw him. The confidence of his footsteps in the hallway, the way he spoke to the nursing staff in that bright and performative register, that was his version of charm. The sound of a man who moved through every space, as though he had already decided it belonged to him. Then he was in the doorway, carrying flowers she had not asked for, wearing a jacket she recognized from a trip they had taken to Rome, looking exactly like himself. He entered with the energy of a man arriving to repair something. "My God," he said, looking at her face, at the bandage above her eye, at the way she was holding herself against the pillow. "Your face." "Hello, Declan." He set the flowers on the surface nearest the door, which was not the bedside table, and came to stand at the foot of the bed, rather than beside it. He looked at her with an expression she could now read with some fluency. It was the expression of a person managing a situation, conducting internal calculations, performing concern while simultaneously assessing responsibility. I am sorry I could not get here sooner, he said. The timing was complicated. I had a situation with— Do not do that, she said. He stopped. I do not need an explanation. I do not want one. A moment passed. His expression adjusted. You are upset. I am injured, she said. Those are two separate things. He paused. Then, what is this about Nora? The adjustment in his face was subtle and immediate, and it told her everything before she said another word. She said, the woman in the red dress, at the gala. He ran a hand through his hair. You want to do this now, here, in a hospital bed. You did not come, she said. You sent a message 11 hours after the accident saying you would come when you could. And then you arrived with flowers and put them on the wrong table. So yes, now, she is a business contact, Ingrid Voss. Her family has ties to certain operations. The contact you saw was professional. I watched you push her hair back, Nora said. I know what I watched. He did not respond immediately. She had learned to read his silences. There were several varieties, and this one was the silence of a man identifying the minimum required to resolve a situation without genuinely addressing it. You misread what you saw, he said. Perhaps, she said. I have been misreading things for 3 years. I am very accomplished at it. Something hardened in his face. What does that mean? It means I drove into a guardrail on a wet highway at midnight because I could not think clearly. And you found out when you saw a message notification. And your uncle sat in that chair for 14 hours before I even woke up. She held his gaze. It means I have been trying to understand what I actually am to you. And I do not think I am going to like the answer. Declan's jaw tightened. Whatever he had prepared to say shifted when she said the word uncle. Something crossed his expression that she had not expected to see there. Not guilt, not shame, not the softening of a man confronted with his own failures. What she saw was sharper than any of those things. It was territorial. It was alert. It was the expression of a man who had just registered a threat from a direction he had not anticipated. Stay away from him, Declan said. She blinked. I mean it, Nora. He is not someone you should be spending time with. He lives in a world you do not understand. He was here because you are connected to me. That is the entirety of it. She stared at him. You are standing at the foot of my hospital bed, warning me away from the man who stayed when you were not here. There is context you do not have. Come home, Declan. Nora, I need you to leave this room, she said. I need you to take the flowers with you. And I need to not hear your voice for a while. His face closed the way it did when a conversation had moved outside the territory he was prepared to manage. He picked up the flowers from the wrong table. He walked to the door. I will call you, he said. She turned toward the window and did not respond. He came back that evening as he had said he would. He did not bring flowers this time. He brought a book and he set it on the bedside table without comment. And he sat down in the chair by the window with the same quality of stillness she had noticed that first morning. And he waited for her to speak, or not speak as she chose. She chose to speak. Declan came today, she said. I know, said Rowan. He did not explain how he knew, and she did not ask. He told me to stay away from you. He looked out the window. That is not surprising. She looked at him. Is he right? About you being dangerous? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Yes, he said without hesitation. In certain respects. He said you were here because of my connection to him. Rowan said nothing. Is that true? No, he said. She absorbed that. Then why? He looked at his hands resting loose on his knees. You were in a hospital bed, he said. You had been in an accident. The person who should have been here was not. He looked back at her. That seemed like reason enough. It was an answer. And it was also a door closed gently but firmly. And she understood that he knew she recognized it as both, and she let it go, because she was too tired to press, and because his version of evasion was more honest than most people's version of transparency. She reached for the book on the bedside table. East of Eden. She turned it over in her hands. Did you choose this specifically? She said. Yes. Why? Because it is about people who cannot escape what they come from, he said, and whether they choose to be good anyway. She looked at him. He was looking out the window at the November dark, at the city, doing what it had always done, existing and moving and being entirely indifferent to the small catastrophes of individuals within it. She opened the book and began to read. He stayed until 11. She was released from the hospital on the 4th day with a set of instructions she intended to follow. For the most part, a referral to a physiotherapist and specific directions regarding the fractured rib that amounted to breathe carefully and do nothing aggressive for 6 weeks. Declan did not come to take her home. He sent a car. She sat in the back and watched New York move past the window, and thought about going back to the apartment, about walking into the rooms she had moved into 2 years earlier. With the easy optimism of a relationship that had seemed to be heading somewhere. The thought produced a heaviness in her chest that was different from the pain in her ribs, more invasive, more difficult to locate precisely. Her phone vibrated. An unknown number. The car is taking you somewhere other than the apartment. I should have asked first. Call me if you want to be redirected. She looked at the message for a long moment. Then she looked out the window and confirmed that they were, in fact, heading downtown rather than east, toward the highway that ran south. She called the number. He picked up on the second ring. I should have asked, he said immediately. No preamble. Yes, she agreed. Where am I going? My property on the Connecticut coast. 3 hours south. It is set up for recovery. The physiotherapy program can be arranged there. The apartment is not designed for a close-in recovery. The estate is. You arranged this without asking. Yes, I am asking now. She held the phone and watched the city begin its transition to highway, the skyline reorganizing itself behind her. She thought about the apartment, about the flowers on the wrong table, about 3 years of small adjustments that had accumulated into something she could not look at directly until a guardrail had made the looking unavoidable. Okay, she said, but do not make me regret it, do. The silence that followed was brief and had a quality she could not entirely read over the phone. Something between acknowledgement and something heavier. I will try, he said. The estate was on the Connecticut coast, and it was the kind of house that had been built to last. Gray stone above the waterline, large windows facing the Atlantic, anchored to the rock as though it had been placed there by someone who intended it to outlast several generations of difficult weather. It was November, and the water was the color of hammered bronze, and the wind moved through the coastal grass in patterns that were almost orderly and almost random simultaneously. She arrived at dusk. A woman named Harriet met her at the door with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who had managed large houses for decades and was not particularly impressed by arrivals but was committed to making them feel welcome regardless. Her room was on the 2nd floor facing east, overlooking the water. It had been furnished with genuine thought. Good light, comfortable proportions, a desk if she wanted to work, Books on the shelves that were real books, read books, not decorative objects arranged for appearance. Rowan was not there when she arrived. He had arranged the room, sent the car, and was apparently occupied elsewhere that evening. She registered this as the choice of a man who understood the difference between providing something and imposing on it. She stood at the window for a long time watching the water darken as the last of the light left the sky, and she thought about Declan's face at the foot of her hospital bed, the calculation behind his concern, the sharpness that had appeared in his eyes at the mention of Rowan's name. And she thought about Rowan's face in the hospital chair, which had not looked like a performance of anything. She had given 3 years of her life to a man who sent a car, and now she was standing in his uncle's house looking out at the Atlantic, and she did not entirely know what she was doing here, but she understood that the guardrail had changed something, had broken something open beyond the ribs it had fractured. It had forced her to confront the version of her life she had been living on autopilot, accepting the shape of things without examining whether the shape was actually what she wanted. She could not go back to the apartment and resume where she had left off. The woman who had driven into that guardrail was not the woman who was going to come out the other side. She did not know yet precisely who that woman was going to be, but she knew the form she was going to take was not the one she had been settling into. She turned from the window and began carefully unpacking her bag, working slowly around the still-present protests of her ribs, and she was halfway through when she heard the front door downstairs, and then footsteps in the hallway, and then a knock. "Come in," she said. He opened the door and stood in the doorway rather than entering, which she had already noticed was his habit. He had changed from the suit into something darker and less formal, though on him the difference was minor. He looked like a man who had come from somewhere and had not entirely arrived yet. "The room is all right," he said. It was not quite a question. "It is good," she said. "Thank you. Harriet will have dinner in about an hour if you want to come down, or she can bring something up." "I will come down." He nodded. He began to step back from the door. "Rowan," she said. He waited. "Declan does not know I am here." "No," he said. "He does not." She held his gaze. "That is going to be a problem." Something moved in his face. Not worry, not calculation. Something older and more complicated than either of those things. "Yes," he said. "It probably will be." He stepped back from the door and pulled it closed, and she stood in the room that smelled of salt and old wood and heard his footsteps moving away down the hallway. And she pressed one hand carefully against her fractured side and breathed through the discomfort, and understood that the problem he was describing was not only about Declan. She finished unpacking and went downstairs. The table in the kitchen was small. There were 2 chairs. He was already seated, and when she came in, he rose briefly, an automatic courtesy without any ceremony, and she sat down. Harriet had left food between them, and the house was quiet except for the sound of the water against the rocks somewhere below. They ate in silence for a while. "You said yes when you should have said no," he said finally. "Not accusatory, observational." She looked up. "To all of it," she said. He held her gaze. "The car. Coming here." Maybe she said, "You know who you are. I know what Declan says I am." Something settled in his expression. "Same answer either way," he said. She put down her fork. "Does that mean I should have said no?" He was quiet for a moment, and in that silence she could hear the ocean working against the cliff below, patient and vast and entirely indifferent to the question being asked by a woman who was still figuring out the shape of the answer. "I do not know," he said finally. She looked at him across the small table in the house above the winter Atlantic, and she understood the weight of what he had just offered. A man who had built something and held it for 15 years, who had navigated things most people did not survive sitting across a kitchen table and saying, "I do not know," with complete and undefended sincerity. "Then we will figure it out," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his fork. Outside, the water kept moving. It was indifferent and enormous and entirely unconcerned with the small and significant thing that had just shifted in a kitchen above the Connecticut coastline between two people who had no reasonable business being in the same room eating dinner, in a silence that had quietly stopped being empty. She did not notice the exact moment it changed. She would notice later, but not yet. She had been at the estate for 9 days when she woke at 4 in the morning to a light still on in Rowan's office. She had not intended to come downstairs. She had woken thirsty and gone to the hallway bathroom, and on her way back noticed the thin line of light under the office door, and heard low and clipped. And in a register she had not heard from him before his voice, not the measured, unhurried voice of a man in control of a room. Something tighter. Something that meant the news being received was bad. She stood in the dark hallway and did not move. She heard 2 words in a low and careful exchange. And then she heard a name. Ingrid Voss. The cold that moved through her had nothing to do with the temperature of the hallway. She went back to her room. She did not sleep. And in the morning at the small kitchen table, with the water doing its gray and methodical work through the window, and the coffee still hot between her hands, she sat across from a man who had not slept either, and she said nothing about what she had heard in the hallway at 4 in the morning. Not yet. But she knew that the thing she had not yet named, and the thing that had been building quietly in the days of shared silences and small meals and the gravity of a man who stayed when he did not have to, was about to become something she could no longer pretend she did not recognize. She told herself she was being careful, that sitting across from him at breakfast and saying nothing about the name she had heard through the office door was a form of patience rather than avoidance. That she needed more information before she said anything. That was what she told herself. The truth was simpler and less flattering. She was not ready for what the conversation would mean. So she ate her toast and watched the water through the window, and let him drink his coffee, standing at the counter the way he always did in the mornings, moving through messages on his phone with the controlled efficiency of a man processing serious information at full volume. And she said nothing. He looked up and caught her watching him. "You did not sleep," he said. "I slept fine." He set his phone down on the counter and looked at her for a moment and said nothing further, which was itself a comment. She put her cup down. "Ingrid Voss," she said. His expression did not change. That was how she knew she had landed on something real. Not a flinch, not a deflection, but a stillness that meant he was deciding what he was going to offer her. "I heard her name," Nora said, "last night, around 4. I was in the hallway. I was not listening at doors. I know," he said. "So you know." "Well, I heard enough to know." It was not good news. He turned toward her, both hands wrapped around his coffee cup. She had the sense of a conversation being decided, not whether to have it, but how much of it to give her. "Ingrid Voss and Declan have been involved," he said, romantically, "for approximately 8 months. The kitchen was quiet. Through the window, a gull worked against the wind over the water, beating forward with the stubbornness of something that had no option of stopping. 8 months, Nora said. She picked up her cup, put it down without drinking. 8 months ago was March. March was when Declan had spent 3 weeks in San Francisco on what he described as a complex acquisition that required him to be physically present. She had supported that. She had sent him a book he had mentioned wanting, a particular coffee he liked. The careful attentiveness of a person who believed they were building something real with someone who deserved it. "Did you know?" she said. "Before. I knew there was something. I did not know the extent of it until recently." "How recently?" "2 days before your accident." She absorbed that. The gull outside was still fighting the current. The wind had not changed its mind. "So when I was at the gala," she said, "watching them together, you already knew." "Yes. And you said nothing." He set his cup on the counter. "It was not my place." "No," she said. "I suppose it was not." She stood and carried her cup to the sink, and stood with her back to him for a while, looking at the water breathing around her ribs with the discipline she had been practicing for days. The careful expansion and release. The body doing its quiet work of repair. 8 months. The math arranged itself without being invited. Declan in March in San Francisco, in a hotel she had never seen with a woman whose name Nora had not yet known to look for. And Nora at home sending coffee and books, being thoughtful, being the kind of partner she had believed the relationship deserved. She pressed her palm flat against the edge of the counter. "I am fine," she said, before he could say anything. "I was not going to say you were not." She turned around. He was still at the counter exactly where she had left him, looking at her with a directness she had spent the first days finding unsettling, and had recently begun to find something else entirely, something she had not yet examined closely. "Does he know that you know?" she said. "Declan knows I am aware." The specifics were not discussed. "Why not?" "Because that conversation has consequences that extend beyond the two of you. Ingrid Voss's father controls 3 import routes on the East Coast that the organization depends on. Any direct confrontation about Declan's involvement with her puts the entire operational relationship at risk." She stared at him. "So he can do whatever he wants, because her father's business is useful. That is not my position." "Then what is your position?" Rowan Hale being quiet was a different thing from most people being quiet. It had weight and intention. When he spoke out of those silences, it meant something had been measured and found ready. "My position," he said, "is that Declan has been making decisions based on what he wants at the cost of anyone in the way, and that this is not a recent development." She looked at him steadily. "Where do I fit into your position?" He was quiet for a longer moment. "I have no position on you," he said. It was an answer, and it was also not true, and she suspected he knew she understood it as both. She reached for her jacket from the back of the chair. "I am going to walk," she said. The physiotherapist said movement was good. "The wind is bad this morning." "I know." She went out through the side door and down the stone path toward the water, and the wind hit her immediately cold and salt-heavy, and without sympathy, and she walked into it with her good shoulder forward and her fractured rib registering each step with a low and consistent complaint. And she walked until the house was small behind her, and the water was close enough that she could hear the full vocabulary of it, every register from deep percussion to sharp hiss. 8 months. She stood at the edge of the rocks and let the wind do what it wanted with her hair, and thought about the version of herself that had driven into that guardrail, the woman who had grown so accustomed to not seeing things that it had taken a collision with a concrete barrier at midnight in a November rainstorm to make the image finally clear. She was not going to be that woman anymore. She did not know yet what woman she was going to be instead, but she felt the form of it out there somewhere, the way you feel the shape of a room you have not yet entered. Real, specific, waiting. She turned back toward the house. The days that followed had a quality she had not expected. Not uncomfortable, not easy either. Something in between, like weather that has not yet decided what it is going to become. She and Rowan moved through the estate with a careful awareness of each other that neither of them named or discussed. He worked in his office with the door open. She began on the 5th day to draw again. It had been 4 years since she had drawn anything with the intention of keeping it. She had left her sketchbooks in storage when she moved in with Declan, because he had said once, not cruelly, but with the dismissiveness of a man who considers himself practical, that the art thing was not really a career path, and she should think about what she actually wanted to do. And she had accepted his assessment of her own work as though his opinion of it were more credible than her own experience of making it. She had added this to the list of accommodations she had quietly standardized, and over time the silence about that part of herself had grown so complete that she had stopped noticing what it was covering. On one of the mornings, Harriet drove her to physiotherapy and she asked to stop on the way back. She bought a sketchbook from the small general store down the coastal road. She bought charcoal. She sat at the desk in the east room with the window open 2 inches despite the cold, and she drew the line where the water met the sky, not quite straight, honest in its vagueness. She drew the way the light moved across the surface of the ocean. In the afternoon, the quality of November coastal light, which had no interest in being flattering. She drew for 2 hours. When she stopped, her fingers were gray to the knuckles, and the page had something on it that was not perfect and was not trying to be. She had forgotten what this felt like, or she had let herself forget, which was a different thing and a worse one. Rowan appeared in the doorway of the east room that evening and looked at the drawings without commenting for a long moment. "You stopped doing this," he said. "Someone told me it was not practical." He looked at her. A long look, the kind he gave things he was taken seriously. "That is not a reason," he said. She looked at the drawing in front of her. "No," she said. "I do not think it is." He left the doorway. She heard him move back down the hallway. She picked up the charcoal and started a new page. Declan arrived on the 18th day. She knew it was him before she reached the window. She heard the car on the gravel, and something in that sound, too confident for the uneven coastal road, told her it was a vehicle chosen for appearance, rather than for the terrain it was being driven on. She looked out and confirmed it. A car that belonged on a Manhattan street, not a Connecticut cliff road in November. She watched him get out. He was dressed well, which meant he had planned for this to feel significant. He stood for a moment looking at the house with an expression she could read even from the 2nd floor. The inventory of a man arriving to reclaim something he has decided belongs to him. She went downstairs. He was already inside when she reached the ground floor. Harriet must have let him in, or he had simply walked through the unlocked door, which would also be consistent with him. He stood in the main hallway with his jacket still on his eyes, moving across the space with the quick efficiency of a man assembling a file. He turned when she came down the last step. He looked at her face, at the healing scar above her eyebrow, at the way she was holding her left shoulder slightly forward to protect the ribs. And for a brief moment, the inventory gave way to something more human, something that might have been genuine. "You look better," he said. "I am getting there." He glanced down the hallway behind her. "Where is he?" "I do not know. This is his house, Nora." "Whatever you came here to say," she said, "say it plainly." She crossed her arms, careful of the ribs, and waited. His jaw moved. She could see the process of selecting an approach. Then something shifted. He looked at her with an expression she had seen perhaps 4 times in 3 years. The expression that appeared when the management of a situation collapsed, and something rawer showed through the gap. "Come home," he said. "Come home and we will work through the rest of it." There is nothing to work through. You are living in my uncle's house, Nora. I am aware of where I am. And do you understand what that looks like? His voice had taken on an edge that was not quite anger, more like pressure. The voice of a man who has decided a situation is no longer acceptable and is communicating that decision. Because from where I am standing, it looks like you had an accident, and you were vulnerable, and Rowan does not do things without reasons. I know him. You might, she said. I am not sure I know you anymore. Something moved across his face. She saw him decide to change the angle. Rowan does nothing without a function, he said. Everything he does. The coffee, the books, whatever he has made you believe is happening here. It serves something. The way Ingrid Voss served something, she said. The air in the hallway changed. His face did something she had not anticipated. He did not get defensive. He went very still, like something caught in open ground deciding whether to hold position or run. Nobody told me, she said. I worked it out. The quality of his stillness deepened. 8 months, Declan. She kept her voice level. While I was at home, while I was supportive and attentive and genuinely believed we were building something together. 8 months. It is complicated. Do not tell me it is complicated. Tell me the truth or do not speak at all. But do not stand in this hallway and manage me. He turned away, turned back. He ran both hands through his hair, and she registered that he was genuinely shaken, which was uncommon enough that she recorded it as information. It did not mean what you think it meant, he said. Then what did it mean? It started as a business matter. Her father needed reassurance. She was the connection. And then, he did not answer immediately. Declan. What happened then? Something I should have stopped, he said quietly. 3 months ago. She sat down on the bench in the hallway because her legs had made a decision without consulting her. Not something that did not happen. Not a misunderstanding. Not a chronology she had constructed incorrectly. Something that had existed, and that he should have ended 3 months ago, meaning it had continued for 5 months before that with full knowledge of what it was. Get out, she said. Nora, I need you to leave this house right now. I am not leaving you here with him. He is 30 years older than you, and he is not. She looked up at him. Her voice was entirely level in the way things are level when they are being held there by simple mechanical effort. I am a grown woman in a house that is not yours. I will leave when I choose to leave, and I will stay where I choose to stay. That is not a decision that belongs to you. He is not what you think he is. You might be right, she said, but you are not what I thought you were either. So that particular argument has very limited traction right now. His face closed. The conversation had moved outside the range of what he was able to manage, and she could see him recognize it and make the calculation that leaving was the only remaining option that preserved anything. He left. She heard his car on the gravel. She heard it reach the road and change into something faster. And then it was gone, and the sound of the water came back in behind it, filling the space his exit had left. Rowan found her 40 minutes later in the East Room sitting at the window, her sketchbook closed on her knees, the water doing its slow and methodical work in the middle distance. He stood in the doorway. He is gone, Rowan said. I know. He came in this time. He sat down in the chair across from her with the deliberate quiet of a man who understood that presence and interference were two distinct things, and was committed to offering only the first. She looked at him. He told me about Ingrid, his version of it. He said it got out of hand. that he should have ended it 3 months ago. Rowan said nothing. "Were you gonna tell me the full version?" she said. "I told you what I knew. You told me what you chose to tell me." He looked at the floor for a moment before he looked back up at her. "Yes," he said, "that is true. Is there more?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands loosely linked. "The full version includes details that make Declan look considerably worse than what I told you. And I was aware that making him look worse served my interests. I did not want to use that as a lever. I wanted you to do your own accounting without my hand on the scale." She stared at him. "Your interests." He held her gaze and said nothing. "Rowan, do not ask that question yet," he said, quietly, not unkindly. "Why not?" "Because the answer changes things. And you are still in the middle of everything. You are still healing. I do not want to be another thing happening to you before you have finished dealing with the last one." He stopped. Something moved in his expression that she had not seen before. Something less contained than his usual register. The surface of something larger underneath. She looked at him for a long time. The light in the east room was going. The afternoon closing the way November afternoons on the coast. Close quickly and completely gray, settling over everything like a decision. "What if I asked anyway?" she said. His hands tightened slightly where they were linked. The only visible sign of anything. "Then I would tell you," he said, "that I have been aware since approximately the 3rd day in the hospital that there was something here I needed to be careful about. And that being careful about it has become progressively more difficult. And that I am aware of how unreasonable that is, and that being aware of it has not made any difference." She held his gaze. The room was almost dark now. Neither of them moved to turn on a light. "Declan's uncle," she said. "His former partner. Yes, there is no version of that that is not what it is." He said it without looking away. She had noticed this about him from the beginning, the unwillingness to soften a difficult truth by looking somewhere else when he delivered it. She stood up. He stood up automatically, the same reflexive courtesy she had come to expect. She crossed the space between them and was aware of his absolute stillness, the held breath of a man who was not going to move first, who would not direct or assume or take more than she offered. She placed her hand against his jaw. He closed his eyes. Just that. Her palm against his face and his eyes closed and the room getting dark around them. And the sound of the water below, patient and enormous, doing what it always did. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then he reached up and covered her hand with his. He did not pull her closer. He did not direct anything. He simply held her hand against his face with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with everything the world believed about Rowan Hale. And she felt that gentleness in her chest, in a place that had nothing to do with the fractured rib. "This is going to cost us something," he said. His eyes were still closed. "I know," she said. "I know what I am walking into, Rowan." He opened his eyes and looked at her. "I drove into a guardrail," she said. "I have already paid the entrance fee." Something broke open in his expression, and then he kissed her. And it was not desperate and it was not urgent. And it was exactly the opposite of both those things. It was deliberate and weighted with everything that years of restraint compress into a very small space. And she felt it through her whole chest, alongside the distinct and separate ache of the healing rib. When they separated, his forehead rested against hers. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the water continued its vast and patient work, indifferent to everything that had just shifted in a room above the Connecticut coast, between two people who had arrived here by entirely improbable roads, and who were now standing in the dark together on the other side of something they could not go back to the other side of. She thought Declan is going to find out. Then, with the clarity of a woman who had recently stopped lying to herself about things he probably already knows. The silence on Declan's end lasted 4 days, not the silence of a man withdrawing. She understood the difference now. The silence of a man preparing. The quiet of someone who has assessed the situation and determined that the next move requires more than he currently has. She had been in enough of his silences to read their texture, and this one had the texture of architecture. Something being built. On the 4th morning, Rowan came into the kitchen at 6 with his phone already in his hand and an expression on his face that she had not seen before, not the contained restraint she had come to know as his default. Something colder. Something that had moved all the way through the reservoir of his control and come out the other side. She was already at the table with her coffee. She looked at him and said nothing and waited. He set the phone face up on the table between them. The photograph was taken through a window. Professional framing. Telephoto lens worked the grain of it visible even on the small screen. It showed the East Room. It showed Nora standing close to Rowan. It showed her hand against his face, and his eyes closed. And the meaning of it was unambiguous to anyone looking, which was precisely the point. She looked at it for a long time without touching the phone. "When was this sent?" she said. "An hour ago. To my phone. To 3 of my captains. And to Meredith." She set her cup down carefully. Meredith called immediately. "She is not calm." "The angle," Nora said. Where was this taken from? Rowan removed the phone from the table. The ridge to the east of the property. Someone was on the grounds. Someone was on your property. Declan sent someone to watch the house, Rowan confirmed. In the same tone he might use to read a weather report he had been expecting and did not welcome. She placed both palms flat on the table and looked at the grain of the wood and breathed. The rib had been largely cooperative for the past week, but it had its opinions about adrenaline, and right now it was making its position known. A reminder that the body kept its own accounting separate from the mind's attempts to manage everything. "How bad is it?" she said. "Complicated." He sat down across from her. She noticed he was wearing the same clothes as the day before, which meant he had not slept. "The organization has a structure," he said. "I built that structure over 15 years. Part of it is about appearance. The discipline of a man whose private life does not compromise his professional one. This photograph suggests the opposite." She looked at him. "And compromising you gives Declan what he needs. It gives ammunition to people who were already looking for it." He looked at his hands. "There are 2 captains whose loyalty has always been conditional. Aldrich Thorne and a man named Fenwick. They manage their territories adequately well enough that removing them would create more problems than it solves. But they have been waiting for a reason to recalculate their positions. Declan has been cultivating them. For approximately 14 months, yes, I had suspicions. I confirmed them this morning." His voice was even. Terribly even. The voice of a man delivering information that was causing him pain at a depth he was not going to display for anyone. 14 months, Nora said. He has been building a position to challenge my authority within the organization. The relationship with Ingrid Voss was part of it. Her father's roots gave him independent leverage. The photograph gives him evidence that my judgment has been compromised. She sat with that. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the water was the color of old tin, the horizon barely distinguishable from what lay beneath it. She thought about Declan at the gala, Declan at the foot of the hospital bed, calculating behind the concern. Declan in the hallway 4 days ago, saying come home with that raw expression she had interpreted as genuine, and now understood entirely differently. He did not come to get me back, she said. He came to confirm what he suspected Rowan said. And we confirmed it for him. She looked at the table. He used us both. He used the situation. Do not mistake yourself for the primary target. I was. She understood the distinction. It did not make it easier to sit with. What happens now, she said. Meredith wants a family meeting in Manhattan. She is not wrong to want one. The photograph has been circulating for an hour, and I have already received 2 calls from concerned family members. Concerned meaning angry, meaning afraid. Fear is what moves people in this family. He met her eyes. Fear of instability, fear of exposure, fear of losing what they have built. Declan chose his weapon carefully. She was quiet for a moment. And what should I do? The question sat between them. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his briefly for the duration of a breath without lingering, then withdrew. You do not have to do anything, he said. This is not your war. She looked at him. Do not take me out of it, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face that was not quite readable and was also entirely readable. All right, he said. She picked up her coffee. Through the window, the water moved steadily, doing what it had done before any of this began indifferent and enormous. Then she said, Tell me everything. Not the version you were managing. Everything. And he did. He told her everything over the next 2 hours, and she listened without interrupting, without filling silences that were doing necessary work. The coffee went cold between her hands. The light changed outside the kitchen window as the morning advanced, the water shifting from iron gray to something with more blue in it. And by the time he finished, she understood the full architecture of what Declan had built, and how long he had been building it, and what it was designed to do. She sat with it for a while after he stopped talking. Then she said, Tell me about the meeting in Westchester. He told her that too. That evening, she stood at the east room window, watching the water, and understood that everything she had survived in the past 3 weeks, the guardrail, the hospital, the slow and painful reconstruction of her understanding of her own life, had been moving towards something she could not yet see the shape of. She did not know what she was going to do, but she knew she was not going to do nothing, and she knew that the woman who stood at this window was not the woman who had stood at the edge of the Plaza Ballroom in a dress chosen for how it photographed. That woman had let other people decide what mattered. This one was still deciding what she was. 2 days passed. Rowan worked without stopping 18 hours at a stretch. The office light on before she came downstairs and still on when she went to bed. She brought him coffee at midnight and found him on the phone standing at the window with his back to the room, and she left the cup on the desk and went back upstairs without interrupting. This was the thing she could do. Understand the difference between being present and being a disruption. She had spent 3 years learning the wrong version of that lesson. Here she was learning the right one. On the morning of the Westchester meeting, she came downstairs at 6 and found him already at the table dressed. Phone in hand, the expression of a man who had processed everything he needed to process and arrived at the other side of it. She sat down across from him. You should eat something, she said. He looked at her. Something in his face that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. You sound like Harriet. Harriet is correct about most things. He ate. She drank her coffee and watched the water and did not say what she was thinking, which was that she did not want him to walk into that room without knowing what she had been turning over since the early morning hours when she had woken and found herself working through the problem, the way she worked through a drawing from the edges inward, finding the structure underneath. His phone was turned off for the drive. She knew this because he told her before he left. Phone will be off for a few hours. Harriet has my number if you need anything. She nodded and watched him go and stood in the kitchen, listening to the car on the gravel, and then to the silence that replaced it. And she thought about 14 months of careful construction and what it meant that Declan had chosen her name specifically, and the thought that had been assembling itself in the back of her mind since Rowan told her everything finally arrived in full. She went to the desk in the East Room and found the notes she had made the night before. The dates, the sequence. She laid it out again, slowly, the way she would lay out a composition, looking for what the structure was actually saying rather than what it appeared to say on the surface. The account. 14 months ago. Before the accident. Before she had ever set foot in this house, or spoken more than 3 words to Rowan Hale at any public event Declan had allowed her to attend. Before she was relevant to any of this. Her name had been on that account before she was relevant, which meant Declan had not used her opportunistically after the accident, after the photograph, after everything that had developed between her and Rowan. He had placed her name in the structure at the beginning, a placeholder, a ready-made piece of evidence waiting for the moment it would be needed, regardless of what form that need took. She had not been an instrument after the fact. She had been a design component from the start. Her phone buzzed on the desk. An unknown number. She answered. Miss Callahan. The voice was measured and male and careful. My name is Aldrich Thorne. I believe we should talk. She knew the name. Rowan had told her. One of the 2 captains whose loyalty was conditional, the one who had called Meredith first when the photograph circulated. How did you get this number, she said. The same way I get most things, Thorne said. I have information about what is planned for Rowan today. Information he does not currently have. She went very still in the East Room chair. What kind of information? The kind that changes outcomes. He paused with the precision of a man who understood timing. The meeting today is not a family gathering, Miss Callahan. It is a vote. Declan has been circulating a formal proposal among the captains for 3 days. A challenge to Rowan's authority within the organization. He needs a majority to carry it. That is not possible, she said. Rowan built this organization. Rowan built it 15 years ago. Declan has been building something else for 14 months. He paused again. He has Fenwick. He has 2 of the 3 New England captains. And he has documentation, financial records, files suggesting that Rowan diverted operational funds to personal accounts. The East Room tilted slightly. That is fabricated, she said. Of course it is. Thorne's voice was entirely undisturbed by this. The question is not whether it is true. The question is whether it is convincing and whether it is presented before Rowan has the opportunity to counter it. Declan presents it today in front of the full family before Rowan can see it and respond. She put her hand on the desk. Why are you telling me this? Because I have been watching Rowan Hale for 15 years. And I know what he has built. And I know what Declan would do with it. And I am not a man who throws away 15 years of reliable leadership because someone showed me a photograph of a woman with her hand on someone's face. He paused. Also because I tried to reach Rowan 3 times this morning. His phone is off. She checked her own phone. One message from Rowan sent at 9. Phone off for the drive. She put it back against her ear. If I drive to Westchester, she said, and walk into that room, I make things worse. If you do not, and Declan presents those files before Rowan has any warning, then Rowan spends the next 48 hours on the defensive. In this organization, 48 hours on the defensive is a very long time. She closed her eyes. She thought about Rowan at the kitchen table that morning eating because she told him to, looking at her, with that expression that had nothing managed in it. She thought about the note on the bedside table, the still warm coffee, 14 hours in a hospital chair. She thought about East of Eden on the nightstand and what he had said about it, about people who cannot escape what they come from, and whether they choose to be good anyway. She opened her eyes. Then her phone buzzed with a message from a second number she did not recognize. Not Thorne's number. A different one. It contained an image. She opened it. Financial documents. Account statements. Her eyes moved across the columns and then stopped and moved back, because something had snagged a name in the third column. The name on the receiving account. Nora Ann Callahan. Her old Boston address. A social security number she could not verify from memory, but which had the correct shape, the correct number of digits. Something about the last 4 that felt almost familiar. She sat with the phone in her hand and the water outside the window, and the document on her screen. The account had been opened 14 months ago, not after the accident, not after the photograph, not after anything that had happened between her and Rowan. 14 months ago, before any of it, before she was anything more than Declan's partner at public events from which she was carefully kept at a distance from his uncle. He had not needed her to actually do anything. He had not needed her to be guilty of anything. He had only needed her name on a document, her address, her social security number, all of which Declan's legal team could access through data brokers whose records were used routinely for legitimate transaction work. He had needed a name that belonged to someone with no prior connection to the organization, no alibi, no way to quickly prove her own ignorance, and no standing in the room where the accusation would be made. She was not going to be a bystander to this. She called Rowan's number. It went to voicemail on the first ring. His voice brief and entirely without performance, asking her to leave a message. She kept her own voice level by a significant effort of will. "Do not let Declan introduce anything until you speak with me," she said. "I know what is in the documents. I know what they did with my name. Call me the moment you can." She ended the call. She sat for 10 seconds. Then she picked up her keys. The drive to Westchester took 40 minutes, and she made it with the heat off, because she needed the cold to keep her thinking clear. Her hands were steady on the wheel. The rib was quiet for once, or she was not paying attention to it, which was effectively the same thing. She rehearsed nothing. There was nothing to rehearse. She knew what she was going to say, and she was going to say it, or the whole thing was going to happen without her. And she found she was incapable of allowing that. The Westchester house appeared at the end of a long private road, lined with bare November trees, gray and skeletal against a sky the color of old iron. It was large and impassive, and carried the weight of a building that had witnessed serious things for a long time. There were 8 cars in front. She parked at the end of the line and sat there for exactly 10 seconds. Then she got out. The front door was unlocked, which meant security was inside rather than at the perimeter. She pushed it open and went in. Voices reached her from the back of the house. She followed them down the hallway, past rooms she had never been in, through a set of doors that opened into what had once been a formal receiving room, now repurposed for exactly this kind of occasion, too large for daily life and carrying precisely the right weight for a family that needed to look at itself. She opened the door and stepped in. 14 people. She took them in quickly. Faces she had never seen. Faces she recognized from the 2 events she had attended in 3 years where Declan had allowed their worlds to briefly overlap. Meredith Hale against the back wall arms crossed an expression of compressed fury. There was also something else underneath it. 2 men by the window she identified as Thorne and Fenwick, respectively by their positions and by the tension between them. And in the center of the room, standing at a table on which documents were laid open, facing outward, was Declan. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. His face went entirely empty. She had never seen it do that. Every expression she had ever seen on Declan Hale had been a managed one chosen, and placed with some calculation behind it. This was none of those things. This was the face of a man whose plan had just developed a variable he had not modeled and had not prepared for. Rowan stood to the left of the table. He turned as the room's attention turned to her, and when he saw her, his expression moved through several things in rapid succession. Recognition, assessment, and then a focused stillness that was not surprise. He had heard the voicemail. She knew it from his posture, not the posture of a man caught unprepared, but of a man who had been warned and was watching to see what the warning was going to do. The room was silent. Someone said, "Who is this?" The tone was not welcoming. She walked to the table. No one moved to intercept her, partly because Rowan had not moved, and the quality of Rowan's stillness in a room communicated things that did not require language. She looked at the documents on the table, the same as the image on her phone. Financial statements, account numbers, her name in the third column formatted and printed for a room full of people who were supposed to see it and draw the obvious conclusion. She looked up. "My name is on this document," she said. Her voice was steady, which cost her something measurable. "I want everyone in this room to know that I became aware of this material approximately 90 minutes ago. I have never held access to any account connected to this organization. I have never received funds from any account connected to this organization." She looked at Declan directly. "Someone opened an account in my name and used it to construct a case against Rowan. I would like to know who in this room has access to the kind of personal information that would require." The silence now had texture, not the silence of people waiting, the silence of people recalculating. Declan looked at her with the expression she had seen in the hallway 4 days ago, territorial and alert, but now calibrated for a larger audience. "She is here because Rowan brought her into this," he said. "That is the point. His loyalty is to her, not to this family." "I called him," Nora said. He did not answer. His phone was off for the drive. Declan's jaw worked. "I left a voicemail." She held his gaze. "Check it. It is time-stamped. You will see exactly when I called and exactly what I said." Rowan lifted his phone from the table. He held it out toward the room without speaking, the gesture of a man who had nothing to conceal, and was finished with pretending the question was still open. Nobody took the phone. The offer itself was the statement. She kept her eyes on Declan. "This account was opened 14 months ago," she said. She kept her voice measured, the way she kept her hand steady when the charcoal needed to be exact. "That is not a coincidence of timing. 14 months ago is when you began building your position. You needed a name. You needed someone with no prior connection to the organization. Someone who could be presented as the vector by which Rowan had been compromised. Someone who would have no standing in this room and no way to quickly prove their own innocence." She paused. "You chose my name before I was ever relevant to any of this, before I had spoken more than 3 words to Rowan at any event, which means this was never about what happened between us at the estate. I was not an opportunity. I was a component, designed and placed before you had any reason to believe I would be useful." She let that sit. The room had stopped breathing. Declan's expression moved. Beneath the management, beneath the calculation, beneath 14 months of careful construction, she saw what was actually there, what had always been there. It was not ambition in its pure form. It was resentment. The resentment of a man who had spent his adult life in the shadow of someone who had not tried to overshadow him, and had done so simply by being what he was. "Explain the date the account was opened," Rowan said. His voice in that room had a quality different from any other voice in it, quieter than she expected, and for exactly that reason more present. 15 years of that voice in that room meant it displaced something when it arrived, the way a stone displaces water without trying. Declan looked at his uncle. The management fell away completely. "You want to talk about dates," he said. "Let us talk about 15 years. He was not shouting. His voice had the vibration of something under sustained pressure. "You have been running this family for 15 years, and half of what we could have taken you left on the table. Half the territory we could have held, you chose not to hold. Because you had lines. Because you needed people to see the reasonable man." His voice was rising now. "I watched you leave money behind. I watched you retreat from positions we could have kept. I watched you make this thing smaller and quieter and more legitimate year by year. And all of it was so you could eventually hand it to someone outside the family. Someone who would dismantle everything we built." He stopped. His chest was moving. "And you are here because of her. A woman you met 6 weeks ago in a hospital bed." Rowan said his nephew's name. He said it quietly in the voice of a man who had known this person since he was born, who had watched him grow into something complicated and painful, and who was not going to pretend otherwise, even now. "Declan." His voice had gone below the level where volume was necessary. "The quieter you were in a room like this, the more people had to stop and listen. Look at what you just said." The room was absolutely still. Declan stopped. He looked around. He looked at the faces. Meredith against the wall. Controlled fury layered over something older and sadder. Thorne, who had moved without Nora noticing when to a position closer to Rowan's side of the room. Fenwick, who had moved to a position closer to the door. He looked at the document on the table. She watched him understand that the room had shifted. Not catastrophically. Not yet entirely. But the weight had changed the way weight changes when a tide turns, and Declan Hale understood momentum better than almost anyone she had ever met. And she could see the moment he recognized that his had broken. "Explain the date," Rowan said again. One more time, with the same quiet. "If that account was opened legitimately for any reason that makes sense, you can explain the date. If you cannot, then everyone in this room can follow the calculation themselves." Declan looked at his uncle, and she saw it then. The thing beneath the resentment. The thing that had been driving all 14 months of careful construction. It was not hatred. It was grief. The grief of a man who had wanted something from someone for a very long time, and had finally decided that wanting it was not going to make it arrive. "You were going to give it away," Declan said. His voice had cracked slightly on the last word, a fracture at the surface. The whole thing. To someone clean. Someone outside. "I watched you make it smaller for 15 years because you wanted to hand it to someone who would take it apart entirely." Rowan looked at his nephew for a long time without speaking. When he finally did, his voice was low enough that only Declan could have heard it clearly. "That was never what I was doing," he said. "And somewhere you know that." Declan's hand moved to the inside of his jacket. The room reacted before Nora's brain fully processed what she was seeing. Meredith moved. Someone near the back wall moved. Thorne moved fast with the speed of a man trained for exactly this possibility. Rowan did not move. He stood exactly where he was standing, looking at his nephew, and his expression had not changed. Not fear. Not threat. The stillness of a man who had made his peace with difficult outcomes and was not going to flinch in front of the people who had been watching him for 15 years. "Don't," he said. One word. In the same voice he had used for the last 15 years in rooms like this. The voice that did not need to be louder than the room to fill it. Declan's hand stopped. The room held its breath. Nora could hear her own pulse. She could feel the healed rib registering the adrenaline like a ghost of the original injury. A reminder that the body remembered everything, even when the mind tried to move on. She stood 1 meter from the table with the document bearing her name laid out on it. And she did not move, and she did not look away from Declan's face. He was breathing hard. His hand was still. His face was completely open. Everything he had spent 14 months concealing now present in the room whether he wanted it there or not. "This does not end here," he said. "No," Rowan said. "It does not end here. But this part ends now." The hand came out of the jacket, empty. Declan stepped back from the table, once, then again. The room released its breath in a slow and careful exhale, and Nora felt her legs communicate to her that they had been operating under significant protest for the past several minutes and would appreciate a reassessment. She put her hand on the table. Rowan was beside her in 3 steps. He did not touch her. He was simply close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and he said quietly near her ear, "Sit down." "In a minute," she said. "You are shaking." She looked at her hand on the table. He was right. She looked up at the room, at the faces that had watched her walk in, and put her name on the document, and hold the line through everything that followed. She looked at Meredith. Meredith looked back at her, and the expression on her face had changed entirely from the compressed fury of her arrival. It was not warm. Meredith Hale's face was not built for warmth in the conventional sense, but it was something more durable than warmth. It was the acknowledgement of someone who has watched a person do a hard thing and has no interest in pretending it was easy. "The account statements can be verified," Nora said to the room. Her voice was steadier now. "The opening date is in the documentation itself. The metadata will confirm 14 months. I can also provide a complete record of my finances and my communications for any period this organization needs to examine." She looked at where Declan had been standing at the empty space by the door. "I have nothing to hide. I would encourage everyone here to ask the same of the person who placed my name on a document I had no knowledge of." Declan was gone. The door was closed. The room remained in its altered silence for a long moment, reorganizing itself around the new shape of things. And then people began to move and speak in low voices. And Meredith pushed away from the wall and crossed toward Rowan, and Thorne moved to speak quietly with one of the men. Nora did not recognize, and Nora sat down on the nearest chair, because her body had voted and the vote was unambiguous. Rowan pulled a chair close to hers and sat, not hovering, not performing concern, simply present in the way she had come to understand was his version of it. After a while, she said, "I need coffee." The corner of his mouth moved. "Yes," he said. "I imagine you do." Meredith stayed for 2 hours. They sat in a smaller room off the main hall, the 3 of them. And Meredith said everything she needed to say, with the directness of a woman who had navigated 6 decades of a complicated family and had no patience for anything indirect. "The vote did not happen," she said. "That is the immediate fact. There are 3 captains unaccounted for in terms of their position going forward. Thorne is solid. Fenwick left before we could determine anything. The New England situation will take time." Rowan said, "I know. The regulatory exposure Declan created is going to take 6 weeks minimum to address." He made certain calls anonymously that we will need to respond to through proper channels. I know that too. Meredith looked at Nora. You walked into this room without standing, without function, without any protection from this organization. She was quiet for a moment. That was not a small thing. It seemed necessary, Nora said. Necessary and brave are not the same word, Meredith said. From the inside, they rarely feel like the same thing either. She looked at her coffee. I told Rowan years ago that his capacity for attachment was a liability in his position, that he needed to contain it. She paused. I was protecting the organization. I was also perhaps protecting him from something I thought would cost him more than it would give him. She looked up. I may have been wrong about that second part. Nobody spoke. Then Meredith stood and said she would see herself out, and she did. Declan made contact 11 days later through a lawyer Nora had never heard of, who sent 3 pages to Rowan's legal counsel. The proposal was structured and cold and covered everything. A full written accounting of the fabricated documents' confirmation of their fraudulent origin in a form admissible in any proceeding, complete withdrawal from the organization and its associated territories in exchange for a financial settlement, paid over 5 years and a guarantee of physical safety. Rowan read it at the kitchen table with the expression of a man doing mathematics he found deeply unpleasant. He is afraid, Nora said. He should be. Are you going to accept it? Rowan set the document down. Meredith thinks yes. She says the cost of pursuing this, fully the exposure, the time, the pressure it draws outweighs the satisfaction. What do you think? He was quiet for a moment. I think I am tired, he said. And I think I need to be careful not to confuse being tired with being willing to forgive things that have not been addressed. She looked at him across the table. That is not forgiveness, she said. That is a question of where you put your attention for the next 2 years. She held his gaze. He built something for 14 months to take what you built in 15 years. If you spend the next year and a half in a legal and organizational response to what he did, then he is still the one deciding where your energy goes. He still wins something. Rowan looked at her. Sign it, she said. And then do something with the next 2 years that is actually yours. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the water moved steadily, and the sound of it had become something she associated with a quality of peace. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something solid underneath it. You are right, he said. I know. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. You say that a great deal. I have been right a notable number of times recently, she said. I am tracking the streak. He looked at her with an expression that had nothing controlled in it. Nothing managed, nothing held back. It was simply what it was. A man looking at the person who had driven 40 minutes with the heat off and walked into a room she had no reason to walk into, and stood in front of people who had no reason to listen to her, and said what needed to be said. The settlement was signed 4 days later. Declan Hale withdrew entirely from the organization. The written accounting was produced and notarized and filed. The financial arrangement was structured over 5 years with conditions that Rowan's lawyers had crafted, with the precision of people who understood what the word terms actually meant. The weeks that followed were not simple. She had not expected them to be. The regulatory attention Declan had drawn required careful management. The Northeastern Territories needed restructuring. Meredith oversaw the legitimate holdings with the efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for an obstacle to be removed and was prepared to move immediately. Thorne proved himself in the reorganization. Fenwick did not. Nora worked. She finished the 3rd sketchbook and started a 4th. A gallery in New Haven reached out after a photograph of her coastal series appeared on a small arts platform she had almost not posted to. She replied, and they had a conversation. And by early December, there was a February show being planned, small and specific, and entirely hers. One afternoon, Rowan came home and found her at the East Room desk with charcoal to her wrist and 3 completed pages, and an expression he had apparently never seen on her before, because he stopped in the doorway and looked at her in a way that was different from all the other times he had looked at her. "These are good," he said, coming to stand behind her, looking at the drawings. "Yes," she said, "they are." He looked at her. The slight adjustment in his face at her complete absence of self-deprecation was something she filed quietly. "You should show them," he said. "Not just the gallery, the body of work. Find someone who knows what to do with it." "Okay," she said. "Just that. No qualifications. No logistics assessed. No practical considerations raised. The simple agreement of a man who understood the difference between supporting something and managing it." She turned back to the page. He pulled the corner chair in close to the desk and sat with his phone and worked in the same space as her. And the silence between them had the quality of 2 people who no longer needed to fill the distance between them with sound. Meredith arrived at the estate 2 weeks before Christmas, without announcing herself, which Nora had learned was simply how Meredith arrived places. She did not signal her approach because she did not want her arrival shaped by the anticipation of it. She appeared at the kitchen door on a Tuesday afternoon in a coat that was excellent, and an expression that was her standard combination of assessment and reserve. Harriet made coffee. The 3 of them sat at the kitchen table. Meredith looked at Nora for a moment. Then she said, "You changed something here." "Several things," Nora said. "I mean in him." Meredith's chin indicated the house, the man somewhere within it. "He is less alone." Nora considered that. "Yes," she said. Meredith turned her coffee cup in her hands once. "The organization is stabilizing. The regulatory attention should resolve in another 6 weeks. The Northeastern restructuring is moving faster than I expected," Rowan told me. Meredith looked at her directly. "He tells you things. Relevant things." She met Meredith's eyes. "I do not ask for more than that." Then Meredith said, "I told him years ago that what he was capable of feeling was a disadvantage in his position. I told him to contain it." She looked at her cup. "I was protecting the organization. I was also protecting him from something I thought would cost him more than it would give him." She paused. "I may have been wrong about the second part. I said that after Westchester. I mean it more now." Nora said nothing. Some things did not need a response. Meredith put her cup down. "You walked into that room," she said, "and because you arrived when you did and said what you said, Rowan had 20 minutes instead of no minutes." She stopped. "I have been in this family for a very long time. I've watched people make decisions under pressure. It was not a small thing." "It seemed necessary," Nora said. Meredith stood and announced she would stay for dinner, if Harriet was cooking, and Harriet confirmed from the other side of the kitchen that she was. And Meredith went to find Rowan in the office, and Nora sat alone at the kitchen table with her hands around her cup and listened to the sound of Meredith's voice and Rowan's voice coming from down the hall. 2 people who had been navigating the same difficult landscape from different positions for a long time, speaking in the shorthand of people who had survived things together. She was not of that world. She was in proximity to it. These were different things, and she held the distinction carefully, because it mattered. She was not going to absorb the logic of that world as her own. She was not going to let the pull of it eliminate the specific weight of who she was and what she was becoming. She had worked too hard for the version of herself that was now emerging, the woman with charcoal on her hands and a February show. and 4 sketchbooks on the desk to give any of it up to the ambient pressure of proximity to power. She finished her coffee and went back to the East Room and drew until dinner. Christmas was quiet in the way that quiet can be a gift rather than an absence. They were alone at the estate, which was not something either of them had planned, and which turned out to be exactly right. Meredith had her family in the city. Harriet took her leave. What remained was the house and the water and 2 people who had spent months surviving things together and had arrived somewhere that was not so much a destination as a recognition. She made breakfast on Christmas morning with her hair loose and one of his sweaters over her own shirt, because sometime in November she had begun wearing his sweaters during the colder evenings, and he had begun not objecting, and the habit had simply remained. He came downstairs and found her at the stove and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before she heard him. She looked over her shoulder. "Are you staring?" "Yes," he said, without apology. She turned back to the stove. "There is coffee." He crossed the kitchen and poured a cup and leaned against the counter and looked at her with the expression she had learned was his version of contentment. Not accomplished happiness, the look of a man who had stopped bracing against something. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. After breakfast, she looked at him. He was looking at his coffee with the expression of a man who had already had the conversation several times in his own head and had arrived at the place where he was ready to have it out loud. "You can talk now if you want to," she said. After breakfast, he said again. She made eggs. She made toast. They ate at the small table with the water showing its winter face through the window, and she did not press him because she had learned that his form of deliberateness was not delay. It was preparation, and what came out of it was always worth the wait. After breakfast, he cleared the plates. He came back to the table and sat down across from her and placed both hands flat on the surface in front of him, palms down, the gesture she had long ago identified as his way of showing his hand. "I want to take you somewhere," he said. "Where?" "The South Cliff, at the far end of the property. There is a place I go when I need to think." She waited. "I have never taken anyone there," he said. She looked at him. "All right," she said. "I want to talk to you there," he said, "about what comes next, for the organization, and for us." She held his gaze. The word landed quietly and settled. "All right," she said again, more softly. The South Cliff was a 20-minute walk from the house along a path that moved through coastal grass and over rocks that had been shaped by decades of Atlantic weather into something sculptural and entirely indifferent to how it looked. The wind was the cold of a New England coastal winter, the kind that found the seams of your jacket and reminded you that you were a temporary visitor in a landscape that had been here long before you and would be here long after. She walked beside him with her hands in her pockets, and the rib made the faintest echo of its original complaint, the ghost of a fracture that the body had repaired and classified as history. The scar above her eye was smooth now, something she touched sometimes without meaning to. The cliff arrived without warning. The path simply ended on a flat rock ledge above the waterline, and the ocean presented itself without preparation. Its full breadth and depth, the horizon so far out it was almost theoretical. The water moving in patterns too large and old to be called patterns. She stopped at the edge and let the wind hit her from below where the waves were breaking against the rock, and she looked at it, all of it, without saying anything. Rowan stood beside her. "I've been coming here since I was 22, he said, "when I took over from my father, when I was not certain I could hold what he had built." She looked at the water. "You held it," she said. "I held it," he said. And then I kept holding it past the point where holding it was what I actually wanted to do. He paused. I told myself the work was the right thing, that discipline and responsibility were enough, that wanting something beyond the structure was a form of weakness. He stopped. I know now that it was not weakness. I know it from a hospital room in November. She looked at him. His profile in the winter light had the quality she had first noticed in that hospital room. A face shaped by hard decisions that had not been avoided. The solidity of a man who had stood in difficult conditions long enough that the conditions had become his measure of normal. He reached into his jacket pocket. He held a ring between his fingers, not presenting it formally, holding it so that she could see it, the winter light catching the edge of it. Something simple and carefully made, the kind of thing that had been chosen rather than selected. She understood that he had gone to the jeweler 6 weeks ago, 12 days after Westchester. In the middle of the organizational crisis, working 18-hour days, he had found the time to do this. In the middle of all of it, he had made this one quiet decision and acted on it. She looked at the ring, then at him. He turned from the water and looked at her, and there was nothing managed in his expression. No strategy, no performance, no part of it designed for anyone else to see. It was a man at the edge of a cliff in December, with the only person he had brought to the place he went when he needed to understand what he actually thought. I am not going to list the complications, he said. You know them. You have been living inside them alongside me. He paused. What I want to say is that I have been coming to this place for 30 years, and there is no longer a version of it that exists without you in it. There is no longer a version of any of it. She looked at him for a long time. The wind moved between them. The water continued its immense and patient work below. She thought about this guardrail. She thought about the hospital ceiling and the still warm cup of coffee on the bedside table. She thought about East of Eden and the small kitchen table and a man who had told her the truth at the cost of his own position, every time she had needed him to. She thought about the East room and his forehead against hers, and the words, "This is going to cost us something," spoken with full knowledge of what they meant. She had already paid the entrance fee. She had told him that night. And standing here now, she understood she had meant it more than she knew at the time. She thought about Westchester and 40 minutes with the heat off and walking into a room she had not been invited into because the alternative was waiting at a distance while something important happened without her. She thought about charcoal on her hands and February and 4 sketchbooks on the desk and the quality of silence between two people who have stopped needing to fill it. She reached out and took the ring from his fingers. She looked at it in her own hand. Yes, she said. He was still. You were going to ask, weren't you? She said. Something opened in his face. The expression the rest of the world had apparently never been given access to. The unguarded version. The one that had been behind the hospital chair and the coffee and the book. And all 14 hours of it. Yes, he said. I was going to ask. Then, yes, she said. To everything you were going to ask. He took both of her hands in his and held them. And she moved closer to him. And they stood at the edge of the south cliff with the water below, and the winter sky above, and the wind moving through the coastal grass behind them in patterns that were almost orderly and almost random. And the sound of the waves breaking against the rock below was the sound of something that had been doing this for longer than either of them had been alive, and would continue doing it long after every difficult choice they had made had been absorbed into the ordinary sediment of a life lived with full knowledge of its own motion. She handed the ring back to him. He understood. He took it and placed it on her finger with a care that had nothing ceremonial in it, and everything sincere, the care of a man handling something that genuinely mattered. She looked at it on her hand. "How did you measure?" she said. "One of your rings," he said. "The dish in the East Room." She thought about that. The image of him in the middle of all of it. The organizational crisis, the restructuring, everything being held together by his quality of stillness. Pausing in the middle of an 18-hour day to pick up one of her rings from the dish by the East Room window and take it to a jeweler who had known him for 40 years. She placed her hand against his jaw, the same gesture she had made in the East Room months ago. The gesture that had started all of it. He closed his eyes in the same way, and she stood on the cliff in December and felt the cold and the wind and the ghost of the healed rib, and understood that this was not a resolution. Resolutions implied that what came after would be easier. This was a foundation, solid not because the difficult things were behind them, but because they had learned what the other was made of in conditions that did not allow for pretending. She had driven into a guardrail. She had walked into a room full of her own name being used as a weapon. She had sat at a kitchen table at 6 in the morning and said, "We will figure it out," to a man who had the honesty to say, "I do not know." None of it had been easy. But she understood now that easy had never been the thing she was looking for. She had been looking for real, for the kind of ground that held when you put your weight on it. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and she lowered her hand, and they turned together toward the water standing side by side at the edge of the south cliff, and the ocean stretched before them in the December light, cold and enormous and entirely indifferent to human complications, continuing its work as it had for centuries, and would continue long after everything they were to each other had become simply the quiet shape of a life built on honest ground that had known from the beginning what it was choosing, and had chosen it anyway. She slipped her hand into his. He held it. The wind moved through the coastal grass behind them. The waves broke against the rock below each one, traveling its full distance from somewhere far out at sea, arriving completely spending everything it had at the end of the long journey. Nothing held back. They stood until the light changed. Then they turned and walked back together along the path through the coastal grass and over the rocks, the house appearing gradually through the bare winter trees. Warm light in the kitchen window where Harriet must have left something on before she went. The smell of wood smoke from the fireplace reaching them before they reached the door. Nora did not look back at the cliff. She did not need to. What had happened there was already part of her, not as a memory she would need to locate and retrieve, but as the kind of knowledge that becomes structural, that a person carries not in the mind, but in the body, in the way they hold themselves, in the quality of the ground they feel beneath their feet. She put her hand on the door. She stepped inside. He followed. The door closed behind them, and the house held its warmth against the December coast, and outside the water continued its patient and relentless work, and the story that had begun with a guardrail and a violent November storm had arrived at the place. All true things arrive at eventually, not an ending but a beginning with its eyes open, asking of them each day exactly what they had already proven they knew how to give.